The city streets hummed with energy as evening settled in, casting a soft, amber glow on the sidewalks. Officer Mark Yates, a dedicated cop with a rigid sense of duty, moved through the bustling scene with a sharp eye, ever on the lookout for anything out of place. It was then he spotted him, a lone man lingering near an upscale office building, standing calmly as if he owned the place. "Excuse me," Mark's voice cut through the air, sharp and authoritative. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" His tone was laced with suspicion, eyes narrowing as he approached. The man turned slowly, offering a polite nod. He was well-dressed, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, and his expression one of calm assurance that only served to fuel Mark's unease. "Good evening, officer," he replied smoothly. "I'm just waiting for my car. Is there a problem?" Mark felt his pulse quicken. He was used to seeing nervous reactions, people averting their eyes, stumbling over words, or showing some sign of deference when questioned. Yet this man stood there, unruffled, almost too self-assured. "There are loitering laws, you know," Mark pressed, his tone hardening. "Mind if I see some ID?" With a small sigh, the man reached into his pocket, retrieving his ID and extending it without hesitation. Dr. Malcolm Everett, the ID read, along with a company badge marking him as a lead scientist at a prestigious research firm. Mark's eyes flicked over the ID, a flicker of irritation surfacing as he registered the credentials. Something about this man, his poised demeanor, his composed response, rubbed him the wrong way. "Well, Dr. Everett," Mark said, a touch of condescension creeping into his voice, "you might think you're above the rules, but out here, they apply to everyone. You've been hanging around here for a while. I'll ask again, what are you doing here?" Dr. Everett's gaze held steady, but his jaw tightened just slightly. "I'm here because I work here, officer," he replied. "And as I mentioned, I'm waiting for my car." His tone remained calm, respectful, though a hint of tension seemed to flicker behind his eyes. Mark felt his authority being tested, and his grip on his belt tightened. "Let's take a little walk, Dr. Everett," he ordered, signaling toward the squad car parked nearby. As the doctor followed, reluctantly compliant, an eerie quiet fell over the busy street, as if the city itself was holding its breath. For in just a few moments, events would spiral in a way that none of them could foresee, a brutal twist of fate that would shake the town to its core and test the limits of justice. Mark Yates wasn't always the hard-edged officer he had become. Growing up in a modest, working-class family, he'd been instilled with the virtues of discipline and respect for authority from a young age. His father, a retired Marine, ran the household with a strict hand, insisting on rules, schedules, and a clear sense of right and wrong. This environment shaped Mark's worldview, embedding a deep-seated belief in order and an almost unwavering respect for authority figures. To him, life was simple. Follow the rules, work hard, and good things will come. Those who strayed from that path were the ones who needed correction. From his early teens, Mark idolized the idea of service. He admired authority and dreamed of a future where he could wield it responsibly, protecting his community. However, as the years went on, he found himself increasingly drawn to the idea of law enforcement, not just for the opportunity to serve, but because it would allow him to hold others to account. His father's teachings about the value of discipline and consequences fueled this desire, and he felt a duty to instill the same values in his community. When Mark first joined the force, he was idealistic. He was determined to bring justice, to clean up the streets, and to make his father proud. But as the years rolled on, the daily grind of the job started to wear on him. He found himself confronting the same faces, the same crimes, and the same excuses day after day. His idealism hardened into cynicism, and his sense of justice became rigid, absolute. The world, he felt, was split into two types of people, those who followed the rules and those who didn't. For the latter, he had no patience. Mark had built a reputation within his precinct as the officer who didn't let anything slide. His coworkers respected his dedication, but often questioned his approach. While many officers understood the need for flexibility and empathy, Mark saw these traits as weaknesses. To him, bending the rules meant opening the door to chaos. In his view, people either respected the law or they didn't deserve its protection. This uncompromising stance had earned him a few reprimands over the years, but he wore them as a badge of honor, a testament to his integrity. At the core of his worldview was a deep-seated distrust of anyone he deemed above the law. Wealthy executives, prominent scientists, celebrities, anyone who seemed to flaunt their privilege or move with an air of entitlement immediately fell under his suspicion. He felt they were the ones who needed to be reminded of their place, especially since, in his mind, they lived beyond the consequences faced by ordinary people. This perspective only grew stronger with time, reinforced by the occasional high-profile incident in which powerful individuals dodged consequences that would have ruined a regular person's life. In these moments, Mark's belief that he was the last line of defense hardened. His biases were most pronounced when it came to people who he thought used their intelligence or social standing as a shield. To him, a person's worth was defined by their adherence to rules, not by titles or accomplishments. He couldn't comprehend, let alone sympathize with, those who lived outside the boundaries he adhered to so rigidly. People who questioned authority, who believed in nuance and discretion, were a foreign concept to him. Mark's past hadn't been without challenges. In high school, he'd struggled with academics, finding his strengths in sports and physical activities rather than intellectual pursuits. He was never the kid with the highest grades, and he'd come to associate academic success with privilege and arrogance. So when he encountered highly educated individuals, particularly those who seemed indifferent to his authority, he felt an old insecurity prickling beneath the surface. To him, a white-collar job didn't make someone better or smarter. It just meant they'd never known the discipline and rigor he considered the backbone of society. In his personal life, Mark's uncompromising worldview boiled into his relationships. He was known to end friendships over political disagreements or if he sensed anyone wasn't doing their part in life. Friends had described him as intense, sometimes difficult to connect with, and his dating life had been similarly rocky. Mark saw compromise as an excuse to let people off easy, and anyone who challenged that view found themselves quickly distanced. To him, it wasn't cruelty, it was honesty. If someone couldn't respect his values, they didn't belong in his circle. As Mark continued his career, his rigidity only grew, unchecked by reflection or self-awareness. When his colleagues mentioned the value of understanding and empathy, he would dismiss it as softness or getting walked over. He crafted a narrative that the world was losing its backbone, giving in to excuses rather than enforcing consequences. So he became that enforcer, the uncompromising authority in a city he felt was becoming increasingly lenient. And while it might have won him respect from some, it also kept him isolated, locked within a worldview where compromise was failure and bending the rules was betrayal. In moments of quiet, Mark occasionally wondered if his life's strict adherence to the law and his distrust of people had cost him more than he realized. But those moments were fleeting. Whenever a situation tested his resolve, he doubled down, returning to his core belief that his job, his purpose, was to protect order, even if that meant pushing boundaries others wouldn't dare touch. Mark's life was structured, his motivations clear, his judgments unwavering. But in the back of his mind, he knew there was little room for anything outside of the path he'd chosen. There was no room for gray, no patience for understanding, and certainly no forgiveness for those who thought they could avoid the consequences of their actions. The night shift had always been Mark Yates' favorite. There was something about the quiet, the cover of darkness, that made him feel even more necessary, a watchful eye guarding the city while everyone else slept. He believed that night duty required a different level of vigilance, and he approached it with the same discipline he applied to every other area of his life. On his patrols, he paid meticulous attention to his surroundings, scanning for anything or anyone that seemed out of place. His judgment was swift and unyielding. It was, in his view, what made him effective. Tonight, as he circled his usual downtown route, he spotted a lone figure lingering by a well-lit office building. The man was tall, sharply dressed in a suit, and stood with a calm ease, his gaze lifted toward the stars, as if he had all the time in the world. For reasons he couldn't quite pinpoint, Mark felt a sense of irritation stir within him at the sight. Mark's mind raced with questions, each rooted in assumptions he'd long held. Why was this man here at this hour? What respectable person would be idling around like this? And then another thought, a suspicion, fed by years of built-up biases, settled in. This man, standing in such a high-end area, exuding an air of nonchalance, had to be up to something. He looked like he had money, intelligence, maybe influence, all the traits Mark instinctively distrusted. Taking a breath, Mark pulled his patrol car to the curb and approached the man. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice steady but sharp. "Is there a reason you're out here this late?" The man turned, meeting Mark's gaze with a calmness that felt almost defiant. "Good evening, officer," he replied, his tone polite but unwavering. "I'm just waiting for my ride. Is there a problem?" Mark's eyes narrowed. In his mind, this man's composure was an act, a shield meant to disarm him. It wasn't uncommon for people who thought they were above the law to use their intelligence or charm to skirt authority. He'd seen it before, he was sure of it. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Mark said, his voice laced with a hint of a challenge. The man hesitated for only a second before reaching into his pocket and producing his identification. Dr. Malcolm Everett, the ID read, followed by his title as a lead scientist at a nearby research firm. Mark studied the ID, but instead of assuaging his doubts, it seemed only to confirm his suspicions. A doctor? A high-profile scientist? Out here alone at night, looking too comfortable by half. In his experience, people like Dr. Everett often believe themselves above scrutiny, beyond reproach. Mark felt his jaw clench. "Dr. Everett," he began, emphasizing the title with a hint of disdain. "It's late, and you've been lingering around here for a while. I've asked nicely, what exactly are you doing?" The man's gaze held steady, his expression unchanging. "As I said, officer, I'm waiting for my car." But Mark heard the subtle defiance in those words, saw the glint in the man's eye that seemed to challenge his authority, and it bothered him more than he'd admit. He had spent years dealing with people who understood the importance of respecting authority, of following the rules, and this man's composure felt like an affront to everything he stood for. It was as though Dr. Everett didn't just want to answer his questions. He wanted Mark to know that he didn't feel obligated to explain himself. Mark's suspicion grew, mingling with his irritation. "Right," he said, his tone hardening. "Because people usually wait for their rides here, don't they? You wouldn't be, say, checking out the building for something, would you?" The doctor's eyes flashed, just for a moment. "Are you implying something, officer?" Mark's heart raced. He could feel the weight of his assumptions bearing down on him, like pieces of a puzzle that he was desperate to fit together. Every instinct told him there was more to this man's story, something Dr. Everett wasn't telling him. He was sure of it. "We'll see," he replied, gesturing toward his patrol car. "Let's continue this conversation somewhere else." Dr. Everett's shoulders tensed, but he complied, allowing Mark to guide him toward the car. The tension between them was palpable, simmering just below the surface as they walked. Every step felt heavy, charged with an unspoken challenge, a battle of wills. To Mark, this was about more than a routine check. It was about proving that no one, no matter their title or their intelligence, could sidestep the law. And to Dr. Everett, the situation reeked of something deeper, a bias that was all too familiar. As Mark led him to the car, a sense of unease settled over the street, the quiet amplifying the tension between them. There was no one to witness this moment, no bystanders to see what was about to unfold. Dr. Malcolm Everett had always been the kind of person who found comfort in routine. At 36, he had achieved a prestigious position as a lead scientist, dedicating his life to groundbreaking research in a field that promised to change lives. His colleagues admired him, his friends respected him, and his family adored him. But despite his accomplishments, Malcolm was humble to a fault, the type of man who'd lend an ear to a stranger or offer assistance to those in need without a second thought. On this particular night, he'd just wrapped up a long day of work. The last few weeks had been grueling, filled with deadlines and endless hours in the lab. He'd barely left his desk, driven by the passion that had defined his career. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, he had allowed himself a quiet moment to breathe, to step outside his office and gaze up at the stars, a rare indulgence in his demanding life. As he waited for his ride, Malcolm felt a sense of calm he hadn't felt in ages. The night air was cool, and he allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, savoring the solitude. It was his chance to unwind, to reflect on his work and the lives he hoped to impact. In that moment, he felt vulnerable, but in a good way, open to the possibilities his research held and hopeful for what lay ahead. Then he heard the voice, a cold, abrupt tone that cut through his peaceful moment like a knife. "Excuse me, is there a reason you're out here this late?" Startled, Malcolm opened his eyes and turned toward the voice, his heart skipping a beat. He saw the officer approaching, his expression hard, his gaze scrutinizing. Malcolm forced a polite smile, trying to keep his composure. "Good evening, officer," he replied respectfully. "I'm just waiting for my ride. Is there a problem?" In that instant, Malcolm felt a pang of unease. The officer's eyes held an intensity that seemed out of place for a simple inquiry. Malcolm, always calm and collected, felt his pulse quicken. He'd heard stories from friends about situations like these. Stories he'd often brushed aside, never imagining he'd find himself in a similar position. But as he looked into the officer's eyes, he sensed something off, a suspicion, maybe even hostility, lurking behind that gaze. Trying to suppress his discomfort, Malcolm reached into his pocket for his ID, hoping to alleviate whatever doubts the officer had. "I'm Dr. Malcolm Everett," he said softly, extending his ID. "I work at the research facility here. I'm just waiting for my car." The officer studied the ID, his gaze flickering over the credentials without any sign of acknowledgement or respect. Instead of calming the situation, Malcolm's title seemed only to deepen the officer's suspicion. Malcolm's unease grew, and he swallowed, his mouth dry. He was used to being respected for his work, but in this moment, he felt strangely small, vulnerable in a way that was both foreign and unsettling. "Dr. Everett," the officer repeated, his tone almost mocking. Malcolm felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. He could feel the judgment, the weight of the officer's assumptions pressing down on him. He glanced around, as if hoping for a familiar face, someone to witness this moment and somehow make it right, but the street was empty and he was alone. "Look, officer, I'm not trying to cause any trouble," Malcolm said, his voice steady but laced with a hint of desperation. I'm just here for work. I really don't want any issues." The officer's expression remained unchanged, and Malcolm felt his stomach twist. This wasn't about his ID or his title. This was about something deeper, something he couldn't control. He felt trapped, helpless under the officer's scrutinizing gaze. In his mind, he ran through his options, wondering what he could say or do to make the officer understand that he was just a man waiting for his ride, a scientist caught at the wrong place at the wrong time. As the officer gestured for him to walk toward the patrol car, Malcolm's heart sank. He complied, feeling an overwhelming sense of injustice, but knowing that resistance would only make things worse. A flurry of emotions surged within him: confusion, fear, and a deep, gnawing frustration. All he had wanted was a moment of peace, a chance to catch his breath after a long day, and now he was being led away as if he were a criminal. As he walked, he couldn't help but think of his family, his friends, the people who knew him for the gentle, dedicated man he was. He thought of the patients he worked to help, the countless hours he'd spent to make a difference, and the irony of it all struck him deeply. Here he was, someone who had devoted his life to making the world a better place, being treated like a suspect. With each step, his heart grew heavier, the reality of his vulnerability sinking in. He'd always believed in justice, in the decency of people, but tonight, that belief felt distant, fragile. This officer didn't see him as a scientist, a doctor, or even a person worthy of basic respect. To the officer, he was just a man on the street, a target of suspicion. Malcolm took a shaky breath, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. How had things come to this? How could a single moment, a single misunderstanding, bring him to this place of vulnerability? If you're feeling the tension in this story and the injustice Dr. Everett is facing, take a moment to comment below. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where someone was unfairly judged? Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more narratives that dive deep into powerful moments like this. Thank you for being here with us. For Officer Mark Yates, the days following his encounter with Dr. Malcolm Everett began like any other. He went about his routine, mentally brushing off the incident as another example of his commitment to upholding the law without compromise. In his mind, he'd simply done his job. Vigilance was necessary, and if Dr. Everett had felt offended, well, that wasn't his problem. But soon, the ripples from that night would grow into a wave of consequences Mark hadn't anticipated. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a written complaint. Mark found it on his desk the following morning, his supervisor's brief note clipped to it. Address immediately, it read. The complaint described Dr. Everett's account in clear, factual language, but even through the formality, the frustration and disappointment were unmistakable. Dr. Everett expressed how the encounter had left him feeling humiliated and targeted, particularly given his long-standing, well-regarded presence in the community. Mark scoffed, shaking his head. So now I'm supposed to just ignore suspicious behavior because someone has a fancy title, he muttered to himself. But as he reread the complaint, a faint discomfort stirred within him. The narrative Dr. Everett described, a man peacefully waiting for his ride, suddenly subjected to undue suspicion, created an image that was hard to dismiss. Yet Mark clung to his resolve, certain he had made the right call. The complaint might have been easy enough to brush off if it had stayed private, but a week later, an article appeared in the city's most read paper, and the story exploded. Local scientist claims unjust profiling by police officer was splashed across the headline, accompanied by an interview with Dr. Everett, who shared his experience with measured but unmistakable disappointment. He spoke not just about his own feelings, but about the broader implications of being profiled, the harm it caused, and the chilling impact it had on trust between the community and law enforcement. Mark's stomach twisted as he read the article. It wasn't just Dr. Everett's words that stung. It was the reactions pouring in from the public. Comments flooded in, condemning the incident as an abuse of power, calling for accountability, demanding that police officers like Mark face repercussions for using authority carelessly. He tried to tell himself it was just noise, that people were blowing things out of proportion, but the sheer volume of criticism was overwhelming. The following day, Mark's captain called him in. Seated across from him, his captain looked weary, an expression Mark hadn't seen before. Mark, he began, voice heavy, we're getting a lot of heat on this. We both know you're a dedicated officer, but this incident, it's brought up some concerns. Mark shifted uncomfortably, trying to mask his irritation. I was just doing my job. He looked suspicious. That's what we're supposed to do. Question things that don't look right. The captain leaned forward, his gaze firm. And sometimes, Mark, we need to question our instincts, especially when they're influenced by things we might not even be fully aware of. He paused, letting his words sink in. You're being placed on temporary leave while we conduct an internal review. It's not a punishment, but it's protocol under these circumstances. Mark's face flushed. Leave? He hadn't expected this. He opened his mouth to argue, but the captain's look stopped him short. The reality hit him like a blow. This was more serious than he'd thought. In the days that followed, Mark's life took on a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. He was no longer out on patrol, no longer carrying the authority he had once worn like a second skin. At first, he tried to bury his frustration, telling himself it was just a formality. But without his badge and his routine, he felt adrift, as if he'd lost a part of himself. And every time he went online or turned on the news, the story was still there, gaining momentum, with people dissecting his actions, debating the morality of his decisions. A week into his suspension, things escalated further. One morning, as he checked his phone, he found an article revealing more about his past record, his complaints, his rigid approach to policing. It painted him in an unflattering light, suggesting that his actions toward Dr. Everett were not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern. The article quoted former colleagues who described him as inflexible, sometimes overly harsh, and unwilling to consider other perspectives. It was a harsh pill to swallow, and as Mark read, he felt the sting of betrayal. He thought he was respected, but this made it clear that his approach had alienated those around him. Now, even stepping outside became uncomfortable. Neighbors he'd once casually greeted began to avoid his eyes, some even muttering under their breaths when he passed by. People he'd known for years looked at him differently, with suspicion or disappointment. A sense of shame started to gnaw at him, mingling with his frustration. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself that he'd only been doing his job, but the creeping guilt was impossible to shake. The final blow came when he received a letter from his father. Inside, he found a brief but pointed message, written in his father's careful handwriting. Mark, I raised you to respect people, not just rules. Don't let pride blind you to the truth. His father's words struck deep, a reminder of the values he'd once cherished, but had somehow lost along the way. He felt a pang of regret he couldn't ignore, a realization that perhaps he'd allowed his rigid beliefs to distort his understanding of justice. In the quiet days that followed, Mark began to reflect on his life, his choices, and the assumptions he'd held so tightly to. He thought about Dr. Everett, about the look in his eyes that night, a look Mark had chosen to ignore. The doctor hadn't been a threat. He'd been a man standing alone, innocent, and undeserving of Mark's suspicion. And for the first time, Mark saw his actions for what they were, an exercise of power that had crossed a line, an abuse he could no longer justify. With each day of his suspension, the weight of his actions bore down on him more heavily. He thought about all the people he'd judged, the moments he'd enforced his will without considering the impact. A sense of regret deepened, settling into his bones. He couldn't change the past, but he could no longer deny the harm he'd caused, nor could he ignore the need to make amends. And as the days passed, that realization grew into a determination, a commitment to change, to seek redemption for his actions, and to find a way to make things right. In the quiet days of his suspension, Mark Yates wrestled with his thoughts. His father's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that the values he once held had become distorted by his pride and rigid sense of duty. For the first time, he saw himself through the eyes of those he had judged, and he felt the weight of the harm he'd caused. It wasn't easy to admit that his life's work, everything he'd once thought was right, had been misguided. But he knew he couldn't ignore the realization that had taken root. He needed to change. Unsure of where to start, he found himself reaching out to a friend he hadn't spoken to in years, James, a former police officer who left the force to work in community outreach. Mark had once looked down on James's decision, seeing it as a retreat from real policing. But now, he saw James as a guide, someone who could help him find a way forward. When they met, James listened quietly as Mark shared his story, every painful detail, and the guilt that had been eating at him. Mark expected judgment, maybe even disappointment, but instead, James nodded thoughtfully. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Mark," James said gently. "But recognizing what needs to change is a start. The question now is, are you willing to do the work?" Mark felt a pang of humility. He knew this would be difficult, and the road ahead was uncertain, but he nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm ready." James invited him to join a community outreach program in a neighboring district that focused on rebuilding trust between law enforcement and local residents. The program held open forums where community members could share their experiences, particularly moments when they felt wronged by the police. Mark attended his first forum with a sense of trepidation, unsure of how he would be received. The room was filled with faces that were wary, many of them carrying stories of painful encounters with officers much like him. When the first speaker took the floor, a young man who shared his story of being wrongfully detained, Mark felt a twinge of recognition. The man's experience mirrored Dr. Everett's in so many ways, a moment of mistaken suspicion, a judgment made without context. As the story unfolded, Mark felt the sharp sting of guilt, but he forced himself to listen, absorbing the words without defensiveness. He realized that, for the first time in his life, he was seeing beyond the badge, understanding the fear and frustration that his actions had sown. Afterward, Mark approached the man and extended his hand. "Thank you for sharing that," he said, his voice laced with sincerity. "I can't change what you went through, but I want you to know that I'm listening, and I'm working to do better." The man looked at him, his expression cautious but slightly softened. Mark saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, and in that brief exchange, he felt the smallest glimmer of redemption. Over the next few weeks, Mark's involvement in the program deepened. He signed up for volunteer shifts, helping with community cleanups, food drives, and educational workshops. He knew these efforts couldn't erase his past actions, but they were a step, a way to serve the community in a different capacity. One Saturday morning, he found himself working alongside a group of teenagers, many of whom came from backgrounds where trust in the police was shaky at best. They were guarded around him, their laughter and conversation dying down whenever he approached. Determined to bridge the gap, Mark made an effort to get to know them, asking about their lives, their goals, and their experiences. It took time, but gradually, their interactions grew warmer, and he found himself enjoying their company. One young woman, Mia, who'd been particularly wary of him, eventually opened up, sharing her experiences of feeling profiled and dismissed by law enforcement. Listening to her, Mark felt the familiar pang of regret, but this time, it was accompanied by a sense of purpose. He realized that part of his journey wasn't just about apologizing or making amends. It was about understanding and advocating for change. He began working with James on developing training materials for the police force, focusing on empathy and de-escalation tactics. He knew these weren't perfect solutions, but they were a start, a step toward preventing others from making the same mistakes he had. As part of his journey, Mark knew he had to address his actions with Dr. Everett directly. With trepidation, he reached out, explaining that he wanted to speak face-to-face if Dr. Everett was willing. The doctor agreed, and they met at a local cafe, a neutral space where Mark hoped they could find common ground. When Dr. Everett arrived, Mark felt a surge of nervousness. The doctor was composed, his expression unreadable. Taking a deep breath, Mark spoke first. "Dr. Everett, I owe you a sincere apology. That night, I can't excuse what I did. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I treated you in a way that was wrong." Dr. Everett listened quietly, his gaze steady. "Officer Yates," he replied, his tone firm but calm, "I appreciate your apology, but words can only go so far. The damage caused by these encounters runs deep. It's about more than just that night. It's about a system that allows those encounters to happen." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the doctor's words. "I know, and I'm working to be part of the change. I'm involved in outreach programs now, and I'm working with my department to address biases in training. I know it's a small step, but I'm committed to making things better, however I can." The doctor's expression softened slightly, a hint of approval in his eyes. "If you're serious about change, then I hope your actions will speak louder than your words. That's what will make the difference." The conversation left Mark feeling both humbled and encouraged. It was clear that redemption would not come easily. It would require sustained effort, humility, and resilience. But the exchange with Dr. Everett gave him a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that his journey was one of service, not ego. As weeks turned into months, Mark's transformation continued. He took on a mentorship role for new recruits, emphasizing the importance of understanding the community they served. He led discussions on empathy, urging his colleagues to look beyond the surface and recognize the humanity in every person they encountered. His reputation within the precinct began to shift. Colleagues noticed the change, some skeptically, others with genuine admiration. Mark knew he couldn't undo the past, but he hoped to build a future where others might avoid his mistakes. In one of his last steps toward redemption, Mark volunteered to organize a town hall event, inviting community members to speak openly with law enforcement. He wanted to create a space for honest dialogue, for accountability, and for growth. Standing before a room of faces, some familiar, others new, he felt the weight of his journey and the significance of the moment. Tonight, he began, his voice steady, "We're here to listen, to learn, and to rebuild trust. I know that trust isn't given lightly, and I know it's been broken, but I'm here and I'm listening, because each of you matters." As he spoke, he saw nods of agreement, a glimmer of hope in the audience. He knew that his path to redemption was far from over, but in that room, surrounded by the community he once saw only through the lens of authority, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He had begun the journey of not just seeing the world differently, but of becoming a different person entirely, one dedicated to service in its truest form. Months of self-reflection, community engagement, and personal growth had reshaped Mark Yates in ways he hadn't imagined. The man who once saw himself as an enforcer of rigid rules now understood the importance of empathy, patience, and humility. His journey had been difficult, filled with challenging moments that had forced him to confront painful truths about himself and his biases. But now, standing on the brink of reconciliation, he felt a sense of calm he'd never experienced before. One evening, the community center hosted a special gathering, a Path to Unity event, where community members, local leaders, and law enforcement would come together to celebrate the progress they had made in understanding and connection. The room buzzed with energy as people gathered, some with lingering skepticism, others with genuine hope that change was possible. Mark knew that many eyes would be on him, watching to see if the man who'd once caused division was truly worthy of trust and acceptance. Among the attendees was Dr. Malcolm Everett. Their initial meeting had left an impact on Mark, but it was only now, after months of self-imposed work and dedication to change, that Mark felt he could truly stand before the doctor with integrity. He'd wrestled with the fear that his apology and efforts might never be enough, that the harm he'd done could never be fully mended. Yet, seeing Dr. Everett there, calm and dignified, gave him a sense of encouragement. As the gathering settled into quiet, James, Mark's mentor and friend, stepped forward to address the room. He spoke of the journey their precinct had taken to rebuild trust, the hard conversations, and the changes that had been implemented. Finally, he turned to Mark. Tonight, we'd like to invite Officer Mark Yates to speak, a man who has shown us all what it means to grow, to acknowledge mistakes, and to work tirelessly to make amends. A murmur swept through the crowd as Mark stepped up, nerves simmering beneath his steady exterior. He looked out at the faces in the room, seeing neighbors, former colleagues, and community members who had once looked at him with suspicion and hurt. "Thank you," he began, his voice sincere. "I stand here tonight as a changed man, not because I was forced to, but because I realized that change was the only path forward. I hurt this community by failing to see its members as individuals, and I let my pride and assumptions guide my actions in ways that were harmful. For that, I am deeply sorry." He took a breath, gathering his thoughts. "In the past few months, I've had the honor of working side by side with many of you, listening to your stories and understanding your struggles. It has humbled me, challenged me, and reshaped how I view my role as a public servant. My only hope now is that my actions can speak louder than my words, and that I can continue to serve this community with the respect and understanding it deserves." As he finished, a quiet, respectful applause broke out, filling the room with a warmth that took Mark by surprise. It wasn't loud or grandiose, but it was genuine, a quiet acknowledgement that his journey mattered to them, that his willingness to learn and grow was appreciated. After the speech, people approached him one by one, extending their hands, offering words of gratitude and cautious forgiveness. Mia, one of the young people he'd worked with during community service, came up to him with a shy smile. "I didn't think you'd stick around this long," she admitted, her voice gentle but teasing. "But I'm glad you did. You've shown us that people can change. Thank you for that." Her words filled him with an overwhelming sense of gratitude, and he nodded, humbled. "Thank you, Mia. That means more than you know." Finally, he saw Dr. Everett approaching. The doctor's expression was calm, a faint but genuine smile on his face as he extended his hand. "Officer Yates, Mark, you've done something remarkable. I didn't think I'd see the day, but I'm proud of the work you've put in. I hope we can both look to a future where things are different for all of us." Mark shook Dr. Everett's hand, feeling a wave of relief and peace wash over him. "Thank you, Dr. Everett. I know I can never fully undo what I did, but I want you to know that it changed me, and I'm committed to continuing that change." They stood for a moment, two men once divided by distrust and misunderstanding, now united in a shared hope for the future. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was real, grounded in mutual respect and the acknowledgement that change, while difficult, was possible. As the evening continued, Mark felt a profound sense of acceptance, not just from the community, but from himself. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace, embraced by those he had wronged, accepted as a man who had made mistakes, but was willing to make things right. He knew his journey was ongoing, but in this moment, surrounded by the warmth and forgiveness of the community, he felt the first true sense of redemption. If this story moved you, make sure to check out our next video, a powerful tale of courage, compassion, and unexpected redemption that will leave you inspired. Click here to watch it now. And remember to subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the heart of justice, transformation, and community. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for being part of our journey.